Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us at tonight's Carcanet event. My name is John McAuliffe, and I'm delighted to be hosting this event in which we are going to launch and celebrate Eavan Boland's final book, The Historians. Before I introduce our two main speakers, I'll tell you about how this event is going to work tonight. We would very much like the launch to be happening in a place where Eavan and her work could have been celebrated by her great company of friends and readers and other poets. But we have tried to put something together in place of that, which we hope will demonstrate the reach and influence of Eavan's poems and the place we think that this book will occupy for her readers. Later on, we're going to hear from the British Guyanese poet Malika Booker, from Maureen Kennelly, who worked with Eavan at Poetry Ireland, from Alice Quinn, whose long relationship with Eavan included publishing her for many years in the New Yorker, from Colm Tobin, who has written so well about Eavan's poems for many years, and finally, from Eavan's daughter, Eavan Casey. We would like it very much if you could use the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, and add in your names there, tell us where it is you're watching us from tonight. And at the end of the event, I'm going to post the link for you to buy the book and the discount code that you can use to obtain a discount when you buy The Historians. I'm going to start now, though, by introducing our two main speakers tonight. They are Jody and Randolf, who is the outstanding scholar of Eavan Boland's poetry. Her essays and interviews with Eavan are indispensable, and her Cork University Press monograph on Eavan Boland's work is the first calling point for anybody wishing to engage critically with Eavan's poems. Her other books with Carcanet include a source book for Eavan Boland, and also the book that she put together with Eavan, A Poet's Dublin. Jody will be joined by Eavan's longtime editor at Carcanet, Micheal Schmidt, who oversaw, he just told me, 31 of Eavan's books into the world. And Micheal, of course, has spoken very eloquently about Eavan and about Eavan's work, but also about her influence on him as a thinker, as a reader of poetry, and as a publisher through her advocacy of different kinds of poetry which have come to Carcanet through her influence. So we're going to begin now, and Micheal is going to talk a little bit about the long track of Eavan's writing life, which led her to this new book, The Historians, which we're so happy to launch tonight.
It is the line, "I have always resisted history." And this notion that Eavan has, that history is something that you stand outside, and it's something that usually excludes you, but there's something else. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who died a couple of weeks ago, had made this very strong distinction. He says that in Hebrew, there's no word for history. The word that's used is zakira, which means remembrance, which is something else. And in remembrance and remembering and remembrance, you re-inhabit the experience, you bring it alive, and it continues to work, as it were, in the present. And I got the feeling over and over again in this book that Eavan was having this sort of argument with history, and really talking about the way in which the things that are left out are almost always, or not almost always, but are often the most important things, including the people that are excluded.
Well, interestingly, if you look at the poem, the paragraph from the same sequence, The Historians, it's probably not the poem you'll remember most from the sequence, but it's a poem that it's actually a metaphor for history. In the poem, there's a barograph recording high and low pressure and basically weather, and then another stanza which talks about the banks recording the ups and downs of the financial. But these aren't the things. These are almost a false history. These are what represent history, but these aren't the stories that matter most to us of what happens most in history. And most of the poems in the sequence, including this one, lean towards what you were just describing, Micheal, which Eavan always talked about as the difference between the past and history, and how these overarching narratives, whether it's the Beargraph or the financial records or the history, leave so much out of what mattered to us and what defined our lives.
Well, the Beargraph is the poem of the week in the Telegraph this week with a wonderful.
Oh, I didn't know that.
A wonderful illustration as well. Much to be sought after. But I think you have to pay to get in, as often happens. This book, I was reading this book, and then again I reread 23 poems, her very first book, which is from 1967. Or it's not her very first book; it's her second book, but the first one she really acknowledges. And it seems to me the trajectory of her work between then and now, as it were, the almost now of this book, is tremendous. She is almost entirely a different poet. There are only little hints in that first book of the way she would go and the direction she would take, because in that book, there are poems dedicated to Michael Longley and Derek Mahan. She's very much one of the, if you like, one of the lads in a way. I mean, obviously she's not. But there are a couple of poems, the big narrative poem at the end, which I find hard to read because it seems very much of its period. But also that really intriguing poem that she dedicated to what's it called? I'll just quickly find it here. I'm not going to read it. But it's a poem called A Cynic in Kilmainham Jail. Do you remember that poem?
I do remember that.
And there her prosody is breaking in the ways it's going to break. And there also, it sort of seems to foretell a lot that's going to happen gradually over the years.
Those poems in that book are very self-willed. You can see all the ambition, and you can see the huge ambition for the technical brilliance that she will later have. You can see all those in the poem. And the Wooing of Etain, that's the long poem that you find hard to read. I found it when I was first came to her work. I found it almost impenetrable. But I learned later, I could see what she was so ambitious for a poet of that age. Written as that was so early in her career at the end of college and the beginning.
Were there other women poets writing in Ireland at the time that she would have considered sisters or fellow laborers?
Poets at the time.
Female poets.
Well, she and Elaine Quillinan shared an office at Trinity then, right? So certainly she would have been aware of Elaine, and I know Nuala, of course, some years later, and a few of the other poets that she had interviewed over the years that she wrote about in various essays. But I don't think that there would have been a huge sense of other women working in the field at the time, other than that, and older, obviously poets in the canon that she'd read.
She was very keen to bring other women into play, wasn't she? I mean, one of the first books she did for us was 3 Irish poets with Paula Meehan, Mary O'Malley, and herself, and that was an interesting chapter.
Right.
It's a wonderful book, and she chooses very well from her own poems as well, doesn't she?
She does, and Paula Meehan's selection in that book is absolutely wonderful too. Yeah, that was an important book for her to do.
And what's funny is when John mentioned we'd done 31 books, she had a much bigger impact on Carcanet than a mere 31 books, because she brought Paula Meehan and Mary into the press. I think she probably introduced me to the work of Jory Graham, possibly of Louise Gluck. She was always making suggestions, and I'm most grateful to her all for introducing me to the work of Bridget Begeen Kelly. So it wasn't one-way traffic, because I think I introduced her to Judith Wright's work, and the great Australian poet, and maybe even Charlotte Mew, whom she selected for us. But she was a huge advocate, and I think that's part of her legacy, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. An advocate on all sorts of levels, certainly for poets and certainly for women poets, but certainly beyond for poets coming from all sorts of traditions that might be resisted or unrepresented properly in poetry. But Micheal, I was just thinking, I was looking through old notes of my conversations with her, which I'm gradually pulling out of storage. And I found one I'd forgotten about from the late 80s, one of our early conversations. And Eavan never complained. She never complained about the hours, how hard she worked at Stanford. She never complained, ever, ever, ever. And she never complained about leading some of the intellectual arguments around women poets. But in this one conversation, it struck me as so different from our other conversations. The Journey had already been published. Outside History wasn't published yet. And she had seen some critical accounts, and she was saying that she gets weary of how the work is never looked at for technically what she's doing as a poem, that she's always standing for the woman in Irish literature, that she's, having to fill that silhouette out all the time. And it wasn't a complaint, it was an observation that at that time in her life, she felt the work really wasn't getting a critical look in, it was getting a political look in. And it wasn't a complaint, it was an observation, but she so seldom ever made that observation that really struck out to me. And then, of course, all the essays, some were already being written at the time, the essays, and a few years later, object lessons. And
in a curious way, the political arguments had to be had and won, didn't they? And I remember her advocacy of Adrienne Rich, which was to begin with quite controversial, certainly over this side of the water, I think. And gradually, the accommodations one made then gradually allowed readers to come at the work with aesthetic expectations rather than political ones. The politics became familiar and indeed accepted. But yes, it was the case that she still is sometimes probably reviled for what she did, and what she did was a tremendous transformation.
Tremendous. She opened a lot of doors for everybody and made the critique. She understood reading Yeats's essays as she did so young, and Rich's essays were also a great object of interest, or great arguments of interest for her. And she was very much in conversation with Rich in her mind, and her conversations with me a lot of the time too. She knew the power of those arguments, and she knew that she was equipped to make them, and did so with tremendous discipline.
But really, what I loved most about this book, I think, was the image of light, which seems to come into almost every poem. And it's a light that was almost absent from the 23 poems. It was a light which was longed for in the 23 poems, but here it is, and it's found in lots and lots of transformative ways. I hope we can come back to that in a minute.
Absolutely.
Shall we move on and invite our other readers in? Just now, and we'll hear the readings, and then we'll come back and discuss things more. And I hope that the audience will plug their questions into the Q&A, and John, I think, will have questions for us as well. But we begin the readings with Malika Booker, followed by Maureen Keneally, who's the director of the Arts Council in Dublin, and Alice Quinn, who I believe may have first introduced me to Eavan's work. I'm not sure. She is a dear friend, and was a dear friend of Eavan's when she was at the New Yorker and after. Colm Toibeen, who shares my passion for Thomas Kinsella and other Irish poets, I'm sure, and Evan Casey, Eavan's daughter. And I should probably give you a warning that her reading is extremely powerful. Over to the readers.
Hi, I'm Malika Booker, and I'm going to be reading a poem by Eavan Boland. I want to say that Eavan Boland was very kind of instrumental in my life. She was, I read her essays relentlessly, and she helped to shape me as a poem. So I'm thrilled and honored to be reading this poem from her new collection. The poem is called Translating the Word Home. A small city disappears in the near-sighted dusk of a coastal winter. Someone is walking home as I once did. Someone is thinking as I did once. This is their neighborhood, their constellation. Once I thought words could describe this. Now I reach for the sable brush my mother once used, lifting it clear from the jar of turpentine. It hasn't seeped in for 50 years. An armed bent, carmine and magenta, alizarine, cobalt, yellow ochre. She's painting a Connemara summer, a riddle of ocean light, a gannet riding a wave, a creel of mackerel, the canvas stretched out and ready to be tacked to the frame, made tight, primed with animal glues and linseed, measuring 3 by 2, more or less. The gesso put on with a white brush. An English fog outside the window. west of Ireland distances on canvas. My mother sat in the pallet to her left, putting her thumb in the opening, reaching for the brush in its jar. What would I do if I found it now? That sable brush that began its journey on the back of a weasel at the center of a Siberian wood, and then migrated from there to the wing of a cormorant, laced with cold Atlantic water. I would use it, I'm sure of this, to unsay my own evening, or at least those parts of it that could be unsaid: granite, ocean grit, distance. I would dip the sable in shadow until a winter evening came in view, its outlined windows reappearing on a road with someone walking home who might be me, inhaling peat smoke. Then open a stitched and bound sketchbook and dip the brush again in azure, lowering the tip of it in window and yellow light, and then wash the whole watercolor block with home.
When I was director of Poetry Ireland, I had the enormous pleasure of working very closely with Eavan Boland. She was our editor of Poetry Ireland Review from 2016 to 2019, and those were glorious years. We absolutely adored working with her. She supported us massively, and she moved Poetry Ireland as an organisation on immensely, and the magazine. And we came to know her well and came to like her very much, admired her greatly. And I admire, of course, the elegance and the sophistication and just the truth in her poems. And coming to know her like that, I came to know her poems better too. So when she died earlier this year, it was an absolutely huge shock, and one that I think the organisation is still reeling from a bit, and the whole poetry community, of course, not just in Ireland, but abroad. So thank you for asking me to read a poem of hers. This is such a pleasure to dive into her work today. So I'm going to read Three Crafts. Three crafts. The spindle was hammered into the stock of the wheel. The legs were turned and smoothed and propped up the spinning motion, which made a small, odd music, more a whirring really, enough to cover up the sound a tree makes on a summer night. The frame that was woven under the curragh was wood and canvas. It was made out of willow or sometimes hazel and was ready for the waters of the western seaboard, a world away from how those same branches once dragged a quiet river in Lucan. On wild nights when trees are getting ready to become memories of themselves, no one will remember I remember stumbling into this art when I was young. How often I wrote late at night, hoping as window latches broke loose and the wind rose and undid all the leaves that what I wrote might be capable of learning from an ocean cadence. Its fall, its rise and fall.
I'm so glad to be here and a part of this celebration of Eavan. I was devastated on the day that she departed this earth, and I'm so proud of her and the great victory of her life and her art and her family life. I first began publishing Eavan's poems while I was at the New Yorker in 1987, and had 20 years of that privilege. And we became, I think, very close friends, and she knew I adored her. One of the early poems, I think the first one we published was The Black Lace Fan My Mother Gave Me. But the second or third was her poem called The River, with an image of a duck boat and a hunter and his spaniel, and his gun poised, and in the distance, the tips of the wild rice drowning in that blue which raids and excludes light. And that became a key to me to how Eavan's diction was so precise and so original, that blue which raids and excludes light. And so I'm happy to be reading a poem about light from the historians, her new book called How We Were Transfigured. Now when darkness starts in mid-afternoon, when evening shows an unwelcome half-sliced winter moon, I remember days when I never thought twice about what was farther off. from the four walls of our house, from the hills above it, from our infant daughters sleeping in it, or what lay in wait for us on the Irish Sea as darkness moved up and away, and we slept late, oblivious to the rain's drizzle, the tap and flicker of it, to what was coming silently, insistently, to render our lives visible to us again. Light the builder, light the maker, fitter of roofs to gutters, of the tree's root to the tree's height, of earth to sky, assembler of openings at the river's mouth and the mind's eye, by Eavan Boland.
There are a lot of big houses in Wexford, and there's actually quite a lot of literature about it. For example, there's Molly Keane's novel, 2 Days in Aragon, about the burning of her family's house. Her father was Captain Scrine. There's J.G. Farrell's novel, Troubles, which of course gave rise to Derek Mann's poem, It Is Used, Shed in County Wexford. Thomas Kinsel's mother-in-law was a Warren, and the Warrens would have been big, they would have owned big houses. And that house in his poem, Another September, is a very beautiful house. It's not a big house. It's more like a dower house. But when he says, near the river sleeps St. John's, because that's St. John's Manor, which is one of the most beautiful houses on the Slaney. And right down the Slaney Valley, when it's from Bunclody or Callow, right down to Wexford, are these beautiful houses, all owned by members of the Church of Ireland. They would have all come at the time of Cromwell. And indeed, there would be earlier invasions, an Elizabethan invasion, but also quite important, the Norman invasion meant that a lot of building was done, especially at castles. But the houses I'm thinking about are big 19th century houses with perhaps 18th century origins. And they are really all over the county. And they actually appear in Banville's novels as well. That he deals with this sort of legacy. One of the reasons is that Wexford has very good agricultural land. That the land, especially in all that Slaney area, but right across, that people would have grown barley and wheat. That it wouldn't just be pasture land. And of course, all of us lived in that world where those houses were both thriving and decaying, where there were, two old ladies living alone in one, or there would be extraordinary auctions, and people would talk about that fireplace. Catholic people, I mean, people in Enniscorthy, that fireplace came from that house, where that auction was being held. So this poem by Eavan Boland is called "The Breakup of a Library" in an Anglo-Irish house in Wexford, 1964. If you arrive by a side road opening out and ending in a gate made from an alphabet of iron animals, and start up an elm-lined avenue leading to the house, you will enter and see books for sale by the window, sleeved in leather, holding in treatises on reason. As you leave, say to yourself the word habitat, a natural home or environment of an animal or plant. Then watch the elms march towards the day they will lose theirs. With the metal animals who have never, no matter what sun rose or set, had one, and reflect the end of empire is and always will be not sedition, nor the whisper of conspiracy, but that slipper chair in the hallway that has lost a name no one will call it by again.
Hi, just to first introduce myself, my name is Eavan Casey, and I am Eavan Boland's youngest daughter. Firstly, on behalf of all of our family, I would like to greatly thank John McAuliffe, Micheal Schmidt, and Jody Randolf for organising and hosting this very moving virtual launch of our mum's final powerful collection, The Historians, and to all those who are taking the time to participate in it. I would also like to greatly thank Carcanet for bringing this wonderful volume to life, where it will so greatly and deservedly endure, alongside our mother's incredible voice and legacy, which has radically challenged history and given voice to so many who have lived and died outside of it. The poem that I have chosen to read today is called Be. The reason I've chosen it is that it speaks so much to our mum's deep-rooted sense of home, her vivid sense of memory, of the simple things that existed in her landscape at home and with her children, and which obviously means so much to us now. Be. If I think of it, what I see are hills, kinetic, never still, shadows building, necessary blues to make dusk. If I think of it, it is already autumn, white thorn trees with their steeped in tannin leaves disappearing in the frame of my window. If I think of it, what I see are the first days of spring, snowdrops just barely visible, but how they came to be there, I will never know. All I know is as the light went, my infant daughters were asleep in it, brightness arcing towards a camber distance. All I know is someday should simply be, not be remembered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eavan. That was a very beautiful reading. And thank you all to all the readers. The poems speak very differently to each of them. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about Eavan. We're all having the same, as it were, the same journey, but we're seeing different things on that journey. And there's so much richness in those poems. Before we continue, I have to make an apology. I was speaking earlier of 23 poems. Of course, I meant New Territory. And Jody kindly drew my attention to this error. So I have now done my public penance. In the collected poems, there are only a couple of poems from the 23 poems, but the whole of New Territory is there. So I confuse the title pages. I do apologize. Jody, what did you make of that selection of poems? What does it tell you about the book itself? Because they were so varied and diverse, but all of them had light.
I was just so moved by it. This book, this is my favorite book of Eavan's. Of course, she would have said my latest book is always your favorite book, Jody. But it's just, this book is just a blaze of glory, in its variety, in its last argument with history, in the, as you said, the beautiful poems with the lights coming to the fore. The poem that Alice read, How We Were Transfigured, that ending, that is just a glorious, gorgeous ending, just absolutely stunning. And you know, that poem, Micheal, I was realizing the other day, that poem is a rewrite of the Tree of Life poem. I don't know if you remember this, the commission for the National Maternity Hospital. As many of you will know, Eavan was the poet in residence at the National Maternity Hospital, which was one of her most prized roles. And when you think of the roles and the different jobs she held in her life, that was one of her very most prized roles. And it's on a piece of granite in Marion Square outside the National Maternity Hospital. And she always felt she'd gotten that poem wrong, the scale of it. I mean, she didn't regret the poem, but she felt she'd gotten the scale of it wrong. So she went back and she did this. And if you go back to that poem and you look at what she's doing with light, with the sun coming up and revealing the relationships again in that first poem, you'll see that she went back and absolutely conquered it in this poem. That last stanza is my favorite thing she's written.
Yeah, to render our lives visible to us again. This is a wonderful phrase, set of phrases, yes. What do you make about the way in which, I mean, that's indicative, isn't it? That a poem is never quite over. You know, a poem recurs to her later in life, and a different strategy is adopted towards it, a different group of images, a different emphasis and scale.
Well, she goes back and back and back to things. I mean, like many poets, she has a certain number of obsessions that she returns to and returns to and returns to and builds on over the years. Another poem in this collection that goes back that might interest readers is everybody knows probably her most famous poem is Quarantine, right? A poem, by the way, that recurred with no revision that I remember. She just wrote it one day and called and read it to me and said, "Isn't this an odd, powerful little poem?" And it was amazing from the minute. But she, in Epithalamium from the sequence, the Irish couple in Epithalamium is the couple from Quarantine. They are revisited, the love poem, they're revisited in the classic marriage poem in that poem. And we actually, she and I actually had a conversation about that I didn't think of again until I read the poem recently. So it is interesting that she goes back and back and back. And those of course aren't the only poems that she's revisiting or obsessions she's revisiting in the book.
Does that tie in with this notion of remembrance, that, you know, you reoccupy the same experience, you revive it, if you like, and an experience, as it were, points backwards and forwards as well. You learn from it, but you also understand from it.
And that you go back to over time, right, and perspective. Yeah, a great favorite of hers was Philip Larkin's, is it Abad? Groping back to bed. Yeah, that was a great favorite of hers, of how the moon means something different to you at different ages. And yes, absolutely.
Lozenge of love, isn't it? Yes, lozenge of love. Yeah.
Medallion of art.
That's right. Very good. Yes, it is a sense of returning, but it seems to me that the returns very seldom go back to the very beginning. That there was that formative period that we talked about before in, you know, the new territory, but the new territory doesn't really emerge from that conditioned environment until a bit later on, when she really begins to find her way. What makes her find her way? Is it reading other poets, or is it something that happened experientially?
You mean, well, I think in terms of looking at her books, where she finds her way is, she always says that she was writing In Her Own Image and Night Feed simultaneously, which is, when you read the two books, that's almost hard to believe because they are so different. And she always talked about them, In Her Own Image as the anti-lyric and Night Feed as the lyric. And in one of our first conversations, I remember saying to her, you know, you really found your voice in Night Feed, right? But she couldn't have done what she was writing them both at the same time, and she obviously couldn't have done what she did in Night Feed without the darker side of In Her Own Image. So I think it was and In Her Own Image, she just deconstructed everything she'd done before, the Warhorse, New Territory. She just deconstructed her whole position and centered it all, a voice in a woman's body, looking radically and very radical for the times, certainly in
So it was, in a sense, it was the experience, obviously, of motherhood and all that went with it that began the transformation. Or was she at the time reading Rich and so on? Do you think there was a reading accompanying it?
She was Rich. I could be wrong about this. I'd have to go back, but I want to say 1983, 84 was when she was reading Rich. But I'd have to go back on. Yes, of course she was reading Rich, and she was reading Plath.
You've slightly disappeared from my earshot. John, can we get Jody back?
And she covered a lot for the Irish Times as well. So she'd had that experience of you know, during the Troubles, spending an awful lot of time up there interviewing different literary people and interviewing some of the paramilitary people. And so she was very involved in that. So it wasn't just motherhood, although certainly that was a huge fuel to her artistic fire, but it was also that sense of the country and what was happening up north.
This book is put together in a very, I guess, a characteristic way, that most of the poems appear in sequences or series, don't they?
Yes.
So there are, as it were, almost chapters with sub-chapters in them, and they don't always seem to me to be from the same period, or indeed from the same using the same stylistic tools, if you like, but she's grouped them in this way. It's a very interesting approach, isn't it? Because you're not just reading a sequence of poems, you're reading a sequence of sequences, if you like.
Yeah, she planned every book that way. In fact, that's where I learned how poets put books together, by watching her. She chose the locations and the sequences of poems very, very carefully, and things moved in, not just this book, but other books, things moved in and out of sequences. I know the poem that Colum read, the chair in County Wexford, I call it the slipper chair poem, was originally in the historian sequence, and she migrated that out into the margin sequence. And I know originally in an earlier manuscript I saw there were more sections to the book with them organized. So she did a lot of organizing and reorganizing of things into sequences.
And Jody, do you think there's a lot of material that has been excluded from this book that may appear later? Will there be a book of drafts? Will there be a book of disiecta membra, sort of rejected bits and pieces that are really rather wonderful?
I hope so. I hope so. I know she did a lot of paring down for this book. She was going through almost a minimalist stage. She was being really savage with what she cut out of poems. I can remember arguing for some bits that were gone that I very much missed to go back in. But going back as far as Anna Liffey, the poem Anna Liffey from what year would that have been? 1990, early 1990s, right? Or early to mid 1990s. There were brilliant bits of that poem that hit the cutting room floor. Parts that I was very sorry to see go. So I'm hoping that there are lots of bits. I know she wrote in journals and she wrote also online, but I know she handwrote in journals, and I'm hoping there's I remember brilliant pieces of poems that hit the floor. And so it would be remarkable to have some of the drafts one day.
Jody, one of our viewers is asking a question here. It's Lottie says, what do you make of her craft stroke textile imagery?
That poem, I'm so interested in that. What she does, she's taking these arts that have faded out of history, right? Spinning and the curra, making the curra, and that's something she's done before. The spinner's wheel is an image, obviously, we've had before, but she's taking these almost obsolescent art and moving them in the end to language, and how language is learning to, hopefully language is learning to rise and fall on the tide. Do I have the right poem in mind? I do. No, it's very interesting what she's doing with the textile and the wood, and in a way, it's also related to the poem that Malika read, where she traces the brush back to the sable, back to the animal's back it was on, where she traces things back to their origin and then brings them forward again, and gives us this sense of transience. And one of the things that Eavan is so gifted at is scope. Just the scope of being able to weave those parts of history, the curra, the spinning wheel, back into the moment and into her art.
Yes, yeah, her mother's quite a strong presence too, isn't she? All through, but in this book, particularly with that poem Malika read, but other ones too in the sequence. It's and again, that's a craft, isn't it? And all the things about gilding and so on that go on.
Oh,
and
very much.
Making of the statue as well, the making of the statue of the woman in the park.
And her very sense of the materiality of art, definitely. I know Paul Meehan said to me recently that one of the great gifts that Eavan gave to poetry in general is this image of the mother as an artist, this image of the mother, materially making art. And certainly that's there from early on in Eavan's work, very early on.
That's very good. Yes, there was a question apparently appeared in the chat box, which I missed, which asks me to comment, but I'm going to ask you to comment on about how the collection structure came about. It reads as if there is a shrinking of space and a dimming of light throughout the book, getting almost claustrophobic through the section margin until the final section and poem blows the roof off the whole thing and lets light and future hope in.
I love that assessment. I love that interpretation. Whoever made that comment, I love that interpretation of the last poem. And I see what you mean about the darkness. I know that some reviewers have felt that this book is gloomier or darker than I think it is. I think you can find, I think the poems, certainly How We Were Transfigured that Malika read, or How We Were Transfigured that Alice read, and Translating the Word Home that Malika read. The images of light, I think, and certainly from the Fire Gilder too, the images of light are there too. It's just, this wasn't written as a last book, but it reads, we're reading it as a last book. And the poet who was a good friend of Eavan's, Nan Cohen, recently said in an essay that last words in a last book often have these flamed edges. And And I think some of these poems read differently because she's gone. I know I couldn't read the Rain poem about the cemetery, the graveyard in Dundrum. I know I had a very hard time myself reading that poem for months after Eavan died, and it was so different. When she was alive, I was like, yeah, that's a nice poem. I don't think it's the best one in the book. But then after she died, it was so hard to read. So I think some of these things can take on different meanings for us too.
Can I ask John McAuliffe to introduce a few of the other questions while I briefly make a vanishing act, but I shall be back. John, will you take over?
Sure.
Thanks.
So before I call out some of the questions, I just wanted to thank you all for the comments on the side. It's such a great parade of names and so many great poets. It's great to see you getting involved in the reading and to hear how much you've enjoyed the poems, and great too to find people saying they're being introduced to Eavan's work at this event tonight, and great to see scholars of Irish literature whose work will have informed Eavan's poems as well, talking about that in the chat. There are a few really terrific questions here on the side, but Jody, I wanted to ask you one question as well, which is just about why the book is called The Historians, because Eavan engages her history so much throughout, right from the start. But why is this book called The Historians? There's a poem of that title, I know, but it's a crucial thing to name the book of poems.
You know, in other books, I can remember her deliberating on having another candidate for a title and deliberating on them back and forth. In fact, I think one of those books, Against Love Poetry, she gave it one title in America, Against Love Poetry, and gave it the title Code at Carcanet, right? But I don't remember that this time. All I remember it ever being was The Historians. And I think because it's been such a central argument of her career, and because that poem, The Historians, is about, it's where, you know, in a lot of Eavan's poems, the emphasis has been on the statue and the young woman or the middle-aged woman or the older woman, as in the case of the poem Broken from this book, contemplating those images. But in the poem, The Historians, the spotlight is actually on the women. And you could see that in her revision process as she went along, that she was taking the spotlight off the heroes and the heroic history and putting it right on the women. And it's the irony of that title, The Historians, when the historians of the title poem are actually burning their family history in their backyards, burning.
Yeah, it's an amazing paradox she drives into in the book, isn't it? All the way through, this sense of attaching meaning to what is wished away or is no longer there.
And also drawing the complicity of women into that, right? So she's complicating her view of history there too, drawing the complicity of women and mothers in particular into that.
Yeah, I love that, the flamed edges that you mentioned earlier as well, which are so much a part of that. A question from Jane Griffiths, and Jane says how much she's enjoyed listening to the poems, but it's always intrigued her that even though her strong sense of home and belonging is in the poems, she seems to observe with the utter lucidity of an outsider. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the centrality of home, but at the same sense, that sense of being outside.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this would be very much rooted in biography for Eavan, very much rooted in her life. She only, to my knowledge, she only had one actual home as a child in Leeson Park, outside of Dublin, where she lived up until she was the age of 6. And that's where some of her memories come from her mother painting in the embassy in London. Her mother stopped painting when she went to New York, when her father was transferred to be Ireland's permanent representative to the UN there. But so she had one home. At 6 years old, she left that home. She went to London, lived in the embassy there, then lived in the embassy in New York. I think they lived in the Vice Regal Lodge, for a while too in London. So she always had official residences after that. And then she didn't have her own home again. She lived in some apartments, but until she and Kevin married and moved into the home that that Kevin still occupies now, the one she writes about so much in this book. So the domestic life, the home life, was something that she lost as a child and regained and wrote about regaining it, and partially regained it through writing about it, in addition to building it with, of course, her family. And so the sense of outsider would have come early to her too, being an outsider, being made to feel an outsider in her London convent schools. And she's written poems about that, and some essays about feeling an outsider. And then in America as well, right, where she was an Irish child raised mostly in London, then taken to New York. New York was a happy period, I think, of her life. And then she came back to Dublin at, I think it was 15 years old. And then the pamphlet that Micheal was referring to earlier, 23 Poems, was the first work where she started to recover that city and recover a sense of location and try to make what she hadn't had, which is a lived relationship with that environment, that city, those buildings.
That's great.
And those people, I guess, too, the literary environment as well. I guess that must have been exciting for her. Yeah.
I think this is a sort of a related question, but it's a question about, which is from Dolores Walsh, who asks, where do you think Eavan has lived most intensely in her poems?
Oh my gosh, her home with her family in Dundrum. Yes, absolutely. But the poem that Malika read, Home, it was about her mother writing about Connemara from London, from the embassy, from painting in London. And I can remember Eavan working on that poem in Palo Alto at Stanford, writing about home in Dublin, right? And she has another poem, Entitled Poem, where she does the same thing. And of course, this poem is a revisiting in some ways of that poem, where again, she takes it further, technically more brilliant, does something much more interesting than that. But, and in her personal life too, she was always home. She, that home was where she lived. She resided more at Stanford, even though her heart was very much in that program. She loved that program and the people there and the young poets and young writers, but her home, she was always living at home and spent a great deal of her daily time on the phone with her family at home and talking to Kevin and Eavan and Sarah.
That's great. I'm going to fold a couple of questions in together now, and maybe Micheal, this might be for you as well as for Jody. And it reflects back on what Jody was talking about, how the later poems are cut back so much from longer drafts. So it's a little bit about her technical brilliance and what it is that she's doing with the material that she works out. And then Fran Brereton asks about whether there are more books to come on the idea of last books, about where the work that has been cut out. And I know you've sort of already talked a little bit about this, but what is it about her technique, I guess, that you notice in the historians? The poems are so lean, I think, and they're still using the sequence form, but would you like to say something about technique in the last book?
Well, you have said it, I think. Reading from the beginning with the collected poems, the new collected poems, I was surprised at how, as it were, four square and how rhetorically structured the early poems are. And obviously, there's a rhetoric in all public objects of language. Reading the new poems, there is something extremely easy, if you like, about the act of reading, not about the act of comprehension, but they're very beautiful and they're not effortful to read. And I think that for the last maybe, well, really since the Livy poem, there has been a kind of relaxation into cadence, if you like, rather than the avoid meter. It's an avoidance of meter, because in a sense meter predetermines what you're going to say, and also the sense that the enjambment is much more a matter of surprise, both for the poet probably and for the reader. And the lines are often much shorter as well, which and I think the short line is something she's really mastered. I don't know. I was looking at another poet the other day, Elaine Feinstein, whose early poems are very short-lined and out of, as it were, William Carlos Williams, and her later poems are much more structured and labored in a sense. And the direction that these poems are going in is the opposite direction. Not that Williams has affected Eavan. She's found her way really through speech, I think, and through reading aloud.
Someone said to me recently that this was a return to a shorter line poem like In Her Own Image, which was not that the poems were in any way like In Her Own Image, but back to some of those shorter lines.
Yeah. Yes, that's what she did, to start using the short line very much, didn't she? Yeah.
I have a couple of questions about place, which I might ask you. Beverly Brahick, hello Beverly. She's always been interested in the fact that Eavan only rarely wrote about California, even though she spent many months there. And Eilish Stanley wants to ask about how differently she's been honoured in the US and other countries, and about how slowly that happened in Ireland. I wondered, Jody, maybe you're in Santa Barbara tonight. I know if you wanted to say something a little bit about that.
Okay,
West
you
Coast.
may need to remind me what the other questions were, but the first one about California, that was something she was very aware of. And the poem I mentioned before, Home, was written in California. And I know she didn't write an awful lot in California. That poem was written, she came a month or two before she started at Stanford. She came to Santa Barbara for a 3-week, it was a distinguished professorship of I think it was with the College of Creative Studies here. And we went out to, I was with her on the occasion of the inspiration for that poem. We went out to a butterfly grove, a monarch butterfly grove, where the monarchs migrate yearly here. And she was very aware of that as a metaphor for what was about to happen in her own life. She was just about it. That was on the cusp of her leaving her own family, right? Where she was coming to Stanford to take this job. And she was in California, but the poem is written about dusk falling on a coastal city, which is Dublin, and on her family's home there on one oblong square, making light out of wheat or wheat out of light, or whatever it is, the last line of that. So yes, but even that poem that was about California went back to Ireland. And her other poems about the US, she has some poems about the Midwest. Obviously the journey takes place in the Midwest, and but her other poems about the US are often poems about Irish people or Irish rooms resettled from the US. And she was aware of that. But the interesting thing to me is she read American writers voraciously, and she read the California writers absolutely voraciously, and looked at what they were doing with imagery in California. So she was very plugged into all of that. But I was at Harvard once with her for a Keats symposium, and one of the poems that was printed in the journal was a poem of Heaney's about I think the president of Harvard. And it was one of Heaney's few poems, she noticed, that was on Harvard and on America and on that time. So, this is something she was aware of that Seamus had done, and that she had done herself too. I don't know why she didn't, other than she very, very much felt she was an Irish poet living in America.
One thing that struck me is that when she died in America, all over Ireland, obviously all over the world, there were wonderful obituaries. And in England, the number of obituaries was very small. And in fact, The Guardian never did write an obituary of her, even though they were...
I wanted to ask you about that, Michael.
They were invited to by a number of people, myself amongst them, but no obituary has appeared yet in The Guardian. Perhaps the anniversary will be noted.
Very good. Well, I think that answers most of the questions in the chat. I think there are some very specific questions which I'm not sure you might be able to answer. I know, Jody, you've given us such an incredible range of contexts, from the early years to the middle years to the American and the later Irish years, and how you talked about the poems. You might know which house in Wexford is in the ransacking of. That's one of the questions in the chat. That's the kind of granular detail we're getting at now.
In my notes, I remember us having a conversation that she had been to an auction. Colin was absolutely right about that. But I can't remember which house. I might have taken a note at the time, but I can't remember. But there was definitely an auction that she went to. Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jody. I think we might finish by going back to the poems. Does that sound right to you, Michael?
Oh, you mean you want me to read that one poem?
I think if that would be...
I'd love to, yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to share the screen again, and I'm going to come back on afterwards to thank you properly, Jody and Michael, but I'm going to pop up this poem that you'll be able to read along with as you hear Michael reading it.
there yet?
Yes, go ahead.
There we are. Virgil in the Georgics was the first, or so he said, to lead the muses into the river shadows of Lombardy. I am reading how his Latinate prince of New Beginnings introduced his high-toned fictions to stripped willows, deeper water. Outside my window, January dark brings ocean salt, grit, and seeds to another freezing Irish dawn. I wonder now if he ever wept as he let them wander, if he doubted whether they would learn to understand an origin. I remember how I longed to find the plenitude and accuracy needed to bring words home to winter hills, fogged away stars, children's faces fading into sleep. Now I wonder if it was enough Virgil, even at this distance, to make us weep.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you again, Jody, and thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been really wonderful to hear these poems. Jody, it's great to hear you say that you think this might be your favorite book. I think it is. There's an amazing lyrical power and ease with that lyrical power in the book. And maybe it is touched by knowing that it is her last book, but it's a tremendous achievement. I'd like to thank Eavan Casey in particular for reading B so movingly for us when we recorded it and making the effort to read what is a difficult poem, to read for us, but for her too. So thank you all. I'm after popping the code for the bookshop into the chat, and I'm going to leave that on for a little while now, so you can make a note of it. And thanks again to Jody in Santa Barbara. The Carcanet readings occur on Wednesday nights, and next Wednesday night we're going to hear from Evan Jones, who has translated Cavafy, and his new Cavafy is going to be discussed by Evan with Alicia Stallings next Wednesday at 6:30. So you can find a link for that on the Carcanet website, and we hope we'll see many of you there. But thanks again, and good night.